Jennifer, you would like to see the Trump administration not act so unilaterally and to bring in other countries. And I'm wondering what the kind of realistic prospects for more burden sharing are. Is this another Zeitenwende moment where there's lots of big dramatic announcements made and then not much happens? Or is it realistic to think that we're actually at a turning point?
Well, I think part of it depends on how the U.S. proceeds. I mean, in the past, the U.S. makes a lot of noise about burden sharing, and then one of two things happen. The first is that they rush in and save Europe, and so then alleviate any sort of demand for Europe to actually step up and do something. And that sort of is what we saw here in the case when the Ukraine war started. We sent more forces. The United States took on the burden of aiding Ukraine to a great extent. Or Europe steps up, and then the United States gets upset because that makes Europe more independent. And so then they interfere with Europe stepping up, and that sort of ends up fizzling out. And so I think both of those paths are very unproductive if what we really want is for Europe to take a larger share of this burden, which is why I think that the negotiations have to be like multilateral. Like Europe has to be at the table. It can't be the United States deciding this. Like Europe has to have a stake. So I think the United States needs to be okay, like not only telling Europe that this is, they need to take a major role, the leading role in guaranteeing any peace and in long-term aid to Ukraine, but also then not interfering if Europe actually does it. The United States has to be okay with that. I think the question mark for me that is hard to answer, and maybe there is no answer yet, is like, how existential does Europe actually consider this war to be? Because they say that it's existential, but many countries in the region aren't acting that way. I was in Estonia last week, and they definitely are acting like they see this as existential, because they worry that if Russia is successful in Ukraine, like they're next. And they point to statements that Putin has made, that they see like a lot of the reasons why Putin invaded Ukraine as like reasons that he would move next on some of their territory. And they have increased spending, and they are like, to that, when I was there, like it did seem like it was urgent, like they're paying higher taxes, and they really are moving, but they're very small. They can't do that much by themselves. And I'm not sure the same urgency exists elsewhere. So I guess the question for me is like, is it existential to Europe? And if yes, then I think if the U.S. steps back, history shows that in cases where the United States has let allies deal with their own worsening security environment, they actually have stepped up. It's very rare that the U.S. does this, but in the few cases the allies have stepped up. So I think it's on sort of both parties. If the United States wants greater burden sharing, it has to leave the space. And then the question is like, how existential is this to Europe?
Yeah, maybe I could just jump in as well. I agree with much of what Jennifer says. I just think that the major challenge for Europe is that it doesn't do European defense. It does national defense. And that's a big problem, because you have a bunch of individual European countries that are docked into the U.S. military. And that's how we've wanted it. We've wanted NATO to be a construct that revolves around us. And my criticism of the Biden administration was that by constantly reassuring Europe that America was back, even over the past 2 years, since the Republicans took back the House, it was very clear that passing Ukraine aid was going to be very difficult. And in fact, no Ukraine aid passed in 2023, and it took until April 2024 for Ukraine aid to eventually get through the House. But yet the administration was reassuring the Europeans that the United States was there. And so actions that the Europeans needed to take 2 years ago, they now need to take. And that creates a fundamental problem. What I mean by those actions is that right now, Europe has done a lot to aid Ukraine. You look at the monetary figures, both for their budget support, but also military support has been really high. The problem is European aid is not as impactful as U.S. aid, because the Ukrainians get a zoo of random different equipment, because you have 27 different EU militaries. You have more than inside of NATO, and they all buy different stuff. because they're not really focused on operating as Europeans together to defend Europe. And that is the fundamental problem. And I think the challenge here is, I actually think, a beginning to sort of shift the burden shifting over to Europe is right, and that makes sense. And that the Europeans can pick up and do a lot more vis-a-vis supporting Ukraine. However, there's going to be a gap. That the ability for the Europeans to now provide more stuff to Ukraine. I mean, we think our defense industrial base isn't up for it. Well, the European defense industrial base has been having their lunch eaten by us for a very long time. It's a weak defense industrial base that is fragmented across national lines, and so this is like an entire generational shift that within Europe, when it comes to defense, it may have to happen very quickly. And so I think if I were the Trump administration, I think it is right to push this shift. I would push the Europeans hard. I would demand they make a lot of the initial reforms, but I also think there has to be some understanding about the time that this is going to take, both before they can actually fully replace the support we're providing on the battlefield in Ukraine, and before they can actually restructure themselves. And I think it will essentially cause the final frontier of European integration is on defense and foreign policy, and that's going to take some time. So I would say it's time to push, but we also need to see give a little bit of breathing room for how long this may actually take.
Dara, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I just, I think about the operational impact if U.S. aid is scaled back, and we don't exactly know what course that's going to take. We don't know if that's going to be scaled back. It seems like that's what the conversation is right now. There's certain systems that just aren't made in Europe anymore, and we have to think about what happens if we were not able to, or we're not willing to supply any more ATACMS or any more Patriot or any of the other custom or bespoke capabilities that we are right now. The Europeans cannot make up all of those capabilities. One exception is artillery shell production, but again, if we step away from doing that, they can't make it up. It's just not possible. And that will change the trajectory of the war for Ukraine, and that will change it very quickly. And I also think about the timelines of things, and the supplemental that is supplying Ukraine right now is probably going to run out very early in terms of PDA, how long it can go. That weapons delivery is probably going to run out in the early part of the Trump administration, and I don't see any legislative activity in that regard. That seems like they're going to pass another one immediately after inauguration. So the war, if it's on the path that it's on right now, it has to be fed. And we saw what happened with a 7 or 8 month delay last time. It was very bad for the trajectory of the war. So I guess I'm pessimistic on what happens to the ability for this war to continue on without U.S. lethal aid.
Could I ask Max a question? So Max, I'm curious. You said that Europe does national defense and not regional defense. And I'm curious, if you see a pathway to making that shift. Is there a world in which there is a European defense that is Europe focused and managed by Europe? That doesn't mean a replacement of NATO, but is that a possible shift? And if yes, how do we get there, and what could the U.S. do? And potentially, it seems to me that the Ukraine challenge is actually maybe a useful forcing function in forcing Europe to think through some of these questions. And could that be maybe something that, it's an ambitious goal, but something that the Trump administration might take on is not just thinking about the future of Ukraine, but using it as a way to have a discussion with NATO allies about what it would look like to have Europe take on a major security challenge like this.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So to me, that the way this works is it's not just the creation of a European army or an EU army, but that the way European integration has worked in sector after sector is it's a very functional effort. We have a problem. How do we solve this problem? So I think the way the Europeans should start is the Americans pull out. Europe has a problem. They don't have enough air tankers. They don't have enough enablers. They maybe don't have enough artillery stockpiles. Well, a lot of money's got to be put behind that, and then you leverage some of their assets and resources of the European Union would be the way I would do it, and you sort of collectivize that, where the EU maybe just has warehouses of ammo, or it buys it buys planes that then the way the European External Action Service, which is their diplomatic corps works, is half of the people are hired by the EU. The other half are diplomats that are just seconded, for a tour here in Washington or elsewhere. And you can do the same thing to sort of have pilots that are seconded from around Europe to then begin flying, air tanker missions. You start, I think, in a very functional way. And then on the defense industrial side, the EU could start sort of trying to harmonize regulations, incentivizing countries to buy together. A lot of the things that are actually right now on the table, but it's sort of a crawl, walk, run. And then how does this fit with NATO? I think what happens is that the EU and NATO begin to really work well together. That once the EU has something to offer NATO, right now they're a bureaucratic, intense fighting the way the State Department and Defense Department oftentimes collide, in DC. And NATO, EU, they don't work together. And NATO looks at the EU and says, you don't do defense. And that's been our position, is that the EU should not do defense. And so what that means is the major vehicle for European integration has been out of the defense game. And I do think that part of what this war is triggering is the EU to do a lot more. EU providing lethal assistance to Ukraine, first time ever. The EU beginning to EU having a defense commissioner, and then looking at what are the resources that the EU has that it could devote to getting countries to buy equipment together, so that you don't have this hodgepodge of random stuff, so that European countries can actually fight together, because they're all operating different stuff with huge maintenance and logistics tails. So I think we're beginning that process. That process should have happened 25 years ago. Should have happened after the Cold War, when the EU was created and there was real momentum, but we opposed it. The United States did, Republicans and Democratic administrations. So it's sort of not fair to the Europeans in some ways to say, why don't you have your act together, when since the Cold War, we're saying, don't get your act together. And I just say that because when we think about national defense in individual countries, they're going to focus on their individual things. Spain is not going to invest a ton in its military because it doesn't face the same threats. So if you're going to make defense at a national level, it's going to be done, with the same threat construction. And then they're also going to miss the key big ticket items. The enabling capabilities that we provide are hard for any individual European country to provide. So I think it's that beginning to have a more integrative collective approach, and that's what the EU can begin to provide.
That last point that Max made reminds me of something that our colleague Ben Friedman says all the time, which is, the U.S. kind of has done so much to kind of suppress European strategic autonomy, and then whenever the rubber hits the road, we kind of turn around and say, "Look at these freeloaders," or whatever. Dara, I wanted to ask you you co-wrote a piece approximately a year ago with Michael Kaufman and Rob Lee called "Hold, Build, and Strike," about the kind of proposing a future strategy for Ukraine, and that over the past year, that's not quite what Ukraine's strategy has ended up being. They've kind of they've made these offensive incursions into Russia. And there's been some holding, but as we now see, after a prolonged stalemate, the front lines are starting to move in the wrong direction, which is to say westward. I'm wondering, what are the realistic objectives that Ukraine can now set for itself, especially with the ramifications of the incoming Trump administration? And all of you, in one way or another, touched upon the difficulties that the obstacles to that negotiations might encounter, including the fact that the more and more the Ukrainians are whittled down, the the more diminished Russia's incentives to negotiate are, and that we may have already passed this kind of peak moment where Ukraine had an optimal level of negotiating power. So I'm wondering to what extent you think that this diminishing position that Ukraine is now facing is in part a result of these not so successful offensive operations it's engaged in, and what whether you think the hold, build, strike idea still holds, as it were, or whether that needs to be updated, and what is a realistic set of objectives that Ukraine can seek to achieve in order to get the kind of deal that it could at least live with.
Thanks. Yes, we wrote that piece last January, and it was a suggestion for how to stabilize the front, buy the time to rebuild reserve forces and get them trained so that eventually Ukraine could be in a position to conduct some sort of limited offensive activity later on, like 2025 or early 2026, because there are some systemic challenges within these brigades, some of it based on slow delay from the West, but some of it based on, some not only manning shortfalls, but just kind of challenges at various echelons inside units for staff work. So, correct. That's not what happened this year. It's hard for me to judge the Kursk operation just yet because it's still in process right now. There are some that say that, well, this drew valuable forces off the front line and now everything is crumbling near Pokrovsk, and that's a huge trade-off. There's another argument that can be made that, well, the forces in Ukrainian forces in Kursk are now the recipients of most of Russia's glide bombs right now. That's what we were told by Ukrainian units that we met with. And that 50,000 Russian forces have been drawn up there, and they're not in the Donbass. So, there's arguments that can be made, but ultimately what matters is Ukraine has to have stable front lines for anything, for any outcome of this war, whether that's a negotiated settlement or whether it continues at a lower intensity or continues at the same. And right now, the front lines are not stable. That's openly discussed by Ukrainian senior civilian and military leaders. That has to be the number one priority right now, is stabilizing the front. And that can be done. And the Ukrainians are actually, they're not doing so bad right now with how they're looking with drones. They feel like pretty confident that their tactics are just as good as the Russians, and in some cases they have parity with them. They're not experiencing shell hunger at this exact time because the supplemental that eventually will run out. But right now they're saying that their main challenge is a shortage of infantry, and that is a huge issue. Because the mobilization system is simply not bringing in the numbers of men to the front that they need. And, there's larger reasons for that. I think the conversations that we had in Ukraine with different groups was not that there is a lack of understanding about the stakes. Of course, they know the stakes are incredibly serious, and they still believe that they have to be free and independent. But there is I would say, a deterioration between the people of Ukraine and not being wanting to be the last person to sign up for a war that's not going well, or being assigned to a unit that is just going to waste them or put them into an assault and they're going to die or get serious injuries. That is the perception. That may not be the statistical reality, but that is the perception of why people do not want to sign up at this point. That trust relationship, in my opinion, really urgently needs to be addressed with changes in strategy. And in my view, I think an objective should be, as Jennifer, you noted, for this moment in time, it really needs to focus on stabilization.